This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Test papers here. Yeah, hopefully it's your student number. Right,
let's get started. I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about that test. I was a little bit disappointed overall. Maybe everyone says that, but I guess there were two things that stand out for me from marking them. One was that some of the explanations that you gave, I know I'm generalising here, some explanations were fine, but some were very vague and didn't get across the message. Like, in particular, when talking about there was a question about, what was it? Yeah, the very first one about colour video signals. Why do we represent things in as YCRCB instead of RGB? What I was after, like a succinct answer, would have been that we are less sensitive to high spatial frequencies in the chrominance, and therefore by converting to YCRCB, it allows us to subsample to reduce the sampling rate for the colour information. But I got explanations that said something like we are less sensitive, just sensitive to chrominance. Well, you know, it's the spatial frequencies that were important. And some people said the luminance is more sensitive, right, which doesn't make sense. It's not that the luminance is sensitive. And maybe, you know, I was wondering if people who wrote that actually understood it but just weren't explaining it, or whether there was confusion there.
Maybe the English is not clear enough.
Well, which, mine or yours? Oh, right. Well, anyway, just be careful about that if you could. And another common problem was in that last question. It was deliberately worded to try to make sure that you understood what you were doing, not just be able to repeat a calculation. So that's why, actually, in the test, I said, don't just give me a measure in centimetres, but answer the question, which actually had an error in it, I must admit. It asked what was the minimum distance, but in fact it's the maximum. But that didn't really affect things. It was the question was, what is the maximum distance from which you'd view the TV, or sorry, view the iPad, and be able to tell the difference between SD and HD? And quite a few people just maybe mechanically did the calculation, get a distance for HD, did the calculation, did a distance for SD, and then left it at that and didn't answer the question. Right? So the point that I was trying to extract was that if you understood what was going on, you would realise that as soon as you were closer to the screen than the SD optimum distance, you would be able to tell the difference. Okay? You didn't even need to calculate the high definition one. Does that make sense?
If we viewing SD closer than DS, then we can start see blocks.
Well, if you work out the optimum viewing distance for standard definition, that's the closest distance. Any closer and you'd be able to see the pixels, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? That's all you needed, because if you got any closer, the pixels in SD would be visible and the HD ones still would not. And even when you get close enough to see the pixels in HD as well, it'd still look better than the SD
And
one.
if we closer than the minimum distance, the optimum distance for HD.
Yeah.
If we closer that,
You would still be able to tell the difference,
then
right?
we can see start to see the pixels.
You would start to see the pixels in HD as well, but you would still be able to tell the difference because the pixels in SD would be larger than those for HD. When you got further away than the optimum distance for SD, in theory, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between either of them. Okay, and that was the critical length I was after.
So if I'm further away from both of them, I won't be able to see the difference.
No, that's the whole point. If you're
Because HD will waste of pixels.
Yeah, exactly. There are more higher spatial frequencies present in the HD, but I'm so far away that I'm not sensitive to them. I can't see them, right? Because I'm you know, we were using that 1/60th of a degree as the threshold. Okay. So if we say we can't see anything that's any objects that are closer together than 1/60th of a degree, then, as you say, the HD is showing stuff that we can't see.
And how do we get H? Do we calculate the pixel for the diagonal line? We get the distance
You need
between each pixel, and then because it's a square pixel, then we can use that same.
Yeah, that's right. A couple of people were confused about the height as well. The measure was clearly given as a diagonal. 24.6 centimetres, I think, was the diagonal. And then knowing the ratio of pixels, and I think the question said that it was, they were square pixels, so the density was the same horizontally and vertically, you would realise that it's that the aspect ratio of the screen was 4:3, 4 wide to 3 high. That's what 2048 to 1536 is, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly. And so knowing that diagonal measure meant that you could find the height. And once you've got the height, you divide it by the number of lines, and that gives you the rest of your triangle. Anyway, if anyone has...
You mean there's an error in question 3. So can I get a point back if I answer the question because it's...
Not if it didn't make a difference to your answer.
Yeah. You know, there's I'm confused at the question in the exam because if the minimum distance will be 0.
Right. Well, but you okay. I'll talk.
But if it's 0, it's no meaning for the calculation. So
Yeah, I'll talk to you about it later about your specific answer. But if you didn't say in your answer something about it, then it doesn't seem that it influenced your answer. But I'll talk to you about it later.
About small, when you ask about small blocks, I said small blocks gives us larger number of motion vector. Like if you wanna use small blocks, then
Yeah.
you provide to the decoder more number of.
More motion vectors. That's right. Yeah.
So I don't know why you said that there's larger motion vector. Maybe the English is not clear.
Ah, okay. I thought you meant the...
No.
I'll talk to you about yours as well, rather than discuss it with everyone. Okay, so let's get to our lecture topic. So we're just about finished video coding. You'd be delighted to know because we've spent a bit of time on it, and then we'll move on to audio and we'll see what's different about audio and some interesting aspects about coding of audio. But I wanted to include two final things. This object-based coding and wire mesh coding, just because they're kind of novel approaches, quite different to what we've seen before. And so even though, well, the object-based coding is used, but in a small way, wire mesh coding is not used commercially as far as I'm aware, but it just provides an interesting contrast to traditional coding. And I didn't want to rush through it at the end of last lecture, because it would have been a bit of a waste of time. So even though there's only 4 or 5 slides, let's just go through these now. So the idea of object-based coding can be understood if we contrast it with conventional coding. So everything that we've looked at to date has said we've got this rectangular image made up of an array of pixels, and we attempt to reconstruct or synthesize that array of pixels at the far end, at the receiver. So we scan them, whether it's interlaced, whether it's or whether it's progressive. We've basically got an array of pixels. We look for differences from one frame to the next, and we do motion compensation and all that sort of stuff. And we chop it up into blocks and do the DCT. But essentially, we're trying to reproduce that array, that changing array. So where object-based coding is different is that we encode the different objects that make up that image, if they are available separately. And this is an example where they would be. So in this case, we've probably got a newsreader who's sitting in front of a green screen or blue screen. You've seen that on TV, I presume. And that means that this image that's actually transmitted is synthesized wherever there's the blue screen, wherever there's that specific combination of chrominance, that blue screen that's behind our newsreader here, they would substitute the background, right? And they may overlay the graphic up in the top right corner there, even though it doesn't exist in the studio. So if we did have a composite video like this, made up of a number of different objects, we have a choice. We can either create or render the whole image at the source and encode it using traditional techniques, or we could encode them separately and do the rendering at the decoder. Right? So we can have a separate encoder for this background, separate encoder for this graphic element, separate encoder for this live guy. Now, why would or could this be useful? Well, actually, you got any ideas why this might be useful? Why might that be a good thing to do?
You can find out which one is more important.
Yeah, that's right. So if we actually know that this background graphic is stationary, stable, not changing at all, then it would require very few bits to encode it. But if we have this image where the newsreader is moving around a little bit in front of it, then we're often having to update it, even though we actually have that information available. We can also assign bits to the most important, or according to the importance. So, for instance, if we had, we probably want to encode our newsreader with more bits than the background, not just because he probably needs them because there's more motion, but because that's going to be the focus of attention. Okay. If you want your test paper, it's down here. And in another application, for instance, suppose we have a sports person, say a tennis player, who's running about on the court. Then maybe we want to apply more bits to the player rather than the background. Just thank you. Okay. So this object-based coding is actually a feature that's provided inside the MPEG-4. I've mentioned a bit vaguely, but I've mentioned that MPEG-4 is a suite of very flexible multimedia representation tools, and it allows things like object-based coding, where we still can encode using things like the block-based DCT, but we just define our blocks to include the entire boundary here, and define that boundary. So there's actually a definition of a line that defines that boundary, so that after all the blocks are encoded and decoded, we can chop out just the boundary of that person in that particular frame and overlay it on the background. There's another reason why object-based coding can be valuable, and that is that we might make different combinations to render the image in a different location or in different circumstances. So, for instance, there could be an advertisement up here, which would be in a different language in different countries, or in different states there might be a different sponsor. Right? So to do the composition at the receiver allows you to easily do that.
Is it like sub-band coding or pyramid coding for the picture?
No, not subband coding divides the picture in the frequency domain. So we take the entire picture, convert it to the frequency domain, and then chop up different frequencies, but they're frequencies that apply across the array. Here we're dividing the picture spatially. Yeah.
How do they define each object?
Ah, that's a really good question. How do you define the object?
I can text it out like as a
Yeah.
single object.
So it's easy in this situation that I described because the original objects are independent. But it's a really hard problem to take an image like this, something like this, in which no, I shouldn't use that example. It's going to be confusing. But if you already had take the sports example. You've got a sports player playing on a field in front of a crowd. To be able to process that picture and extract that player is a hard problem to do it reliably. But in a circumstance where the various sources of the image are already separate, say in an animation or something like that, it could have application. Of course, having defined the boundaries of these objects, that also makes it easier to do things like provide interactivity to the objects, because you can easily define that this particular area is linked to an element of the picture, and then you click on that and you are taken to the appropriate place.
So it depends on the encoder, how the encoder to define.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And how you do that would not be the subject of standardization as well. It's in fact, MPEG-4 has not defined how you extract those components of the picture. It just provides the tools that allow you to encode them separately if you wish to. And no, that's right. Okay, and so the other more, well, fairly advanced or different novel way of coding that I wanted to talk about is something called, for short, wire mesh coding, but its more formal title would be knowledge-based analysis synthesis coding. So that sounds very complicated, but if you break it down, it kind of makes sense. So in everything that all the image and video coding that we've talked about so far, we haven't assumed very much about the content of the image. We've said our only requirement or assumption or model has been that it changes only gradually in time or in space, and we rely on that to reduce the bit rate. But we haven't assumed anything about what the subject was, whether it's a landscape or a sports show or a Head and Shoulders talking. But the knowledge-based bit of this is, what if we can assume something about the source of the video? And the most obvious one is, what if it is a talking head? Right? So if it's a talking head and we can parameterize the description of the talking head, that is, we can recognize the features, recognize where the eyes are. We have the tools to do that. You can find a face on Facebook, and then, as I say, we can describe these things using parameters. So instead of encoding all the pixels that make up a talking head, we instead just need to send descriptions of how the talking head changes. So we would describe the movement with things called action units. And in fact, there's of the many, many things that MPEG-4 is able to do, it has defined a facial animation parameter set, 68 facial animation parameters, that describe things like how you open the left eye by a certain amount, or curve the lips up by a certain amount. So you can actually synthesize the face instead of trying to reproduce an array of pixels. Okay, and why is it analysis synthesis? Well, we analyze the image to try to fit our model to the face. We extract our parameters. We then synthesize the image according to those parameters, and then and that's what we reproduce. As you might expect, this form of video coding can be very efficient. Right? We're not trying to define all those pixels, we're just sending a small number of animation parameters. But it is quite difficult to extract those facial animation parameters from the video input. and it's difficult to make the reconstruction look natural. The other feature that you might expect is if there's an error, we don't just get a couple of pixels that are a funny colour for a couple of seconds. We might get a complete distortion of the face, making it look quite unnatural. I haven't got an example of coded wire mesh model of a face, but I have got an example, just a YouTube clip of the extraction of these parameters and the synthesis of the face. So I thought that would be worth just having a look at. Probably won't. Don't worry about what the text is. This is just the software that's used to do it. But the idea is that we hopefully automatically, in this case it's manually, fit a model to the particular face. So we've got a model made up of all these little triangles, and either we automatically or manually need to match it to the particular face. And then you can describe the features with these animation parameters. So you can synthesize an expression instead of encoding it as it happens. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it looks a little unnatural. Okay. Make sense? Anyone confused by that? Yeah.
So, is it used for saving bits?
Yes, sorry. Because, as I say, we're not describing this array of pixels anymore. We are having transmitted one frame, effectively, to describe that face, and then fitted this model to it, then we're just sending a small number of parameters each frame or each few frames to say, raise the eyebrow, curl the lips, and so on. But I haven't got a bit rate for you. Just an interesting, as I say, novel approach. Okay, so enough of all the video. We're now going to move on to audio finally, and so I need to change slide pack. Sorry. Sorry, I thought I already had that sorted out. Anyway, so this is what we're going to talk about in audio compression.
Less difficult than
Oh, it's really easy. Yeah. It's a piece of cake. You'll enjoy it. So, and we're going to do it in two parts. We're going to first, because of that distinction between different audio service categories that we talked about in the first lecture, right? It's quite. We have these two quite distinct classes. One being speech compression for telephony, or voice on IP, or speech in teleconferencing, or anything like that. And then another completely quite different category of natural sound, or natural or arbitrary sound. So in the first case, we're putting a constraint on the source, as we'll explain. So the fact that it comes from speech makes a difference in how we encode it, not just in terms of bandwidth, but we'll see there are particular features of speech production that we can utilise when we are compressing the signal. In the second case, we don't have those constraints, right? We could have any frequency that the human ear could detect, up to 20 kilohertz or so, and it could be music, could be sound effects, could be natural sounds from the environment, could be anything. So we don't have that constraint on the source. So we'll see that we approach the compression of these different types in a quite different way. So let's talk first by, or start by looking at speech coding. So we can go back to this diagram, this very, very simple diagram that I used as a bit of a framework for compression, where we talked about, is there something about the statistics of the signal that we can exploit, so Huffman coding and arithmetic coding and so on, or are there constraints, or is there something we know about the source, or is there something we know about the destination of our signal that we can take advantage of? So, for instance, the fact that we're differently sensitive to, of course this is the audio case, but as we've seen with images, the fact that we're differently sensitive to different spatial frequencies means that we can exploit that in our coding, knowing something about the recipient or the end of our chain, the destination. Okay, the receiver. But in this case, we're talking about encoding speech, and so we're going to consider issues about what the source of the signal is. Within audio, as I said, we're going to split it into speech and natural audio with these characteristics. I repeat, it's not just a matter of the different bandwidth, but the fact that this one has an arbitrary source, and could also be surround sound, actually. I hadn't mentioned that earlier. And in the speech case, of course, we know something about the source of the sound, its voice. There are other categories you could include in audio signals, so synthetic audio or synthetic speech, so MIDI, for instance, up in the top right there, but we're not going to consider them. Essentially, they're just data applications. So there's nothing particularly interesting about the audio there that we can take advantage of. So let's start with these speech coders and the different approaches that we can take. The first most obvious thing we can do when we want to encode some speech is just attempt to follow the waveform as it's sometimes described. So we just try to reproduce the fact that our speech signal causes an electrical voltage that follows a particular pattern over time. Can we try to approximate that, not taking into account anything about the fact that it is speech? Or we can take these approaches that we'll look at in a moment, in which we do directly take account of how speech is produced and attempt to synthesize it in some way. We can also do things that use other coding approaches that we've talked about, subband coding, that is splitting the signal up into different frequencies, or transform coders. They are used, but they're not really exploiting the features of speech. So just briefly, let's talk about the waveform coders, and then we'll look at the audio, the speech-based ones. So if we're just performing waveform encoding of speech, then the solution is pretty obvious, and we won't spend very much time on it. From what we know already, we just have to do Nyquist sampling. If we've got a 4 kilohertz or less telephony signal, then we need to sample at 8 kilohertz. 8 bits per sample is adequate for telephony. We use telephony as our reference. That gives us 64 kilobits per second. And that's exactly the rate that is switched around the digital telephone network. There are more efficient approaches, even though they're just waveform encoding. We can do things like predictive coding. Adaptive differential PCM is an approach that's used with With speech, it's just a predictive coder, so we've got a familiar prediction loop, except that the adaptive bit means we dynamically change our quantizer and adapt the prediction accordingly. Nothing very interesting and new from what we've seen before, but let's talk about speech properties, and that will lead us to some new approaches to encoding. So, what do we know about the source? The fact that it comes from someone actually talking. Well, we need to consider how speech is produced. So we start the anatomy lesson. No, there's not really an anatomy lesson. You do not have to remember that that's the thyroid cartilage. But I just use this this graphic to illustrate how speech is produced. You might think it's all very straightforward, but it's not. And the interesting aspect is that, to a first approximation anyway, there are two quite distinct types of sounds that we make when we speak. So, how is speech produced? Well, we have a signal source. Thinking of it from a signal processing point of view, we have a signal source which comes from air being expired from the lungs and passing through the vocal cords, which vibrate, open and close in certain circumstances. And the resulting sound is then passed through what is effectively a filter, which is this resonant cavity that's made up of the mouth, the nasal cavity there, and is changed according to the position of the tongue and the teeth, and so on. So the first thing we can do is think, well, we could model that if we have a signal generator that simulates this and a filter that simulates that. Yeah? So, speech is produced. It's by expiration of air from the lungs, the vocal cords vibrating, and the vocal tract behaving like a pipe, like a resonant pipe, and the changing or the different mouth acoustics. And the interesting thing that differentiates these two categories of speech that I mentioned before is whether the vocal cords are vibrating. And they don't vibrate all the time. And I can illustrate this with what might seem a bit of a strange thing to do, but consider this one word, house. It's arbitrary. I mean, there are many different words that illustrate this. But if you say this and at the same time press your fingers to the side of your throat there, and if you say house and concentrate and make the sound of the ow longer, so ow, you'll feel the vibration of your vocal cords, right? Ow, ow. But when you get to the S bit, what happens then? No vibration. Yeah. And so the vowel-like sounds, ah, e, ow, e, are what's called voiced speech segments, and the other ones where which are more noise-like, like the h and the s, there is no vibration of the vocal cord. So all that's happening is air is being expired from the lungs, passing through the open vocal cords, and the change in the sound is made different only by the position of the tongue and teeth and so on. Okay, so these two types of sounds are produced. As I say, it's a first approximation. It's not ideal, but it's quite effective. And so we have the voiced sounds in which the vocal cords vibrate, and the unvoiced sounds in which they are just held open. Why is that important? Well, I guess it's the two middle dot points that are the critical ones, and that is that the voiced sounds are periodic. They're periodic because of this vibration of the vocal cords, and the unvoiced sounds are much more noise-like. So you can see perhaps where we're going if we just go back to this idea, right? If we can detect that a particular speech segment is voiced, and we know the pitch period, then that can be our signal generator. And if we know that a speech segment is unvoiced, then we can use something that's noise-like as our signal generator. As long as we can also approximate the filter characteristics, then maybe we can synthesize voice instead of encoding the waveform. And that's the direction we're going in. So the vocal tract and the nasal cavity have these resonant frequencies, which are called formants. So there are particular peaks in the frequency response, which we need to characterize. And we also need to recognize that you can't change the vocal tract very quickly, right? It involves physical movement of the mouth and the tongue. And so if we sample it every 20 milliseconds or so, that's adequate to describe it. So we might need to sample a speech waveform at 8 kilohertz, which is, what, 125 microseconds, is it? Sample period, something like that. If we were trying to sample the original waveform, but if we're just trying to characterize this changing vocal tract, then we only need to sample every 20 milliseconds or so. So here's a segment of speech in which we are saying, whoever is saying the words, "should we chase?" And you can see in there the oo and e and a are the, which ones are they? They're the voiced ones. Yeah, voiced. That's when the vocal cords are vibrating. And that's where we see this periodic structure. It's not sinusoidal, but it's periodic, right? We have this repeated wave segment. And the other parts, the sh, the ch, the s at the end, are quite noise-like. And you see that this looks almost like white noise, right, here in these segments. Interesting also to see the significant difference in the level, right, of the voiced and the unvoiced speech segments. So the idea where we're heading is, can we detect that for this period of time we have a voiced segment and we have a particular pitch period, and we somehow need to characterize the frequency components within that pitch period, that voiced segment, and synthesize the sound of what is it? E. No. Chase. And at other times, at these other times, can we use a noise generator, may say a white noise generator, and shape the frequency content according to our model of the vocal tract. And that becomes our simulated or synthesized voice. So the speech input comes in, we decide, is this segment voiced or unvoiced, and that's depending on what's happening in the throat here. Are the vocal cords vibrating or not? And so we can do that by analysing the frequency content. If the vocal cords are vibrating, then we can look to try to extract what the period is. If they're not, then we can characterise the level of the noise that we're using. And in both cases, we're trying to characterise this filter, which is dependent on the vocal tract. We're not trying to obviously characterise the physical structure of the vocal tract or the nasal cavity there. We're just trying to extract what its frequency response is. Then, if we can extract all of these parameters, then this is all we need to send to a decoder. We don't need to reconstruct the signal, but rather, from of course, the basis of all of this is that we're assuming that voice is indeed the source, and if voice is the source, and the model fits well, then these few parameters should be enough to provide some synthesis of the voice rather than encoding every sample point. So there are two important categories of voice coder that take advantage of this approach. The simplest one is the most direct one is called an LPC vocoder, linear predictive code vocoder, and this one does exactly what we've described. We segment the incoming voice signal into frames, into time segments, model the parameters as we've just described, transmit those parameters. That's all we need to send, those parameters, and they allow the synthesis, the generation of synthesized voice at the decoder. The pitch period defines the period of a pulse generator, which simulates the vocal cords. We've got a white noise generator that we can switch in the event that it's an unvoiced signal, and we can use our model of these filter parameters to constantly update our vocal tract filter, which is a linear predictive coder. That's where the LPC bit comes from. So these LPC vocoders have been around for quite a long time. They can encode voice at a very low rate, 2.4 kilobits per second or even less. So remember that just straight digitized speech is 64 kilobits per second, so that's a significant saving. The speech synthesis is done at the decoder only. Now, you might think, well, of course it is, but we'll see in the next approach that we can do something a bit more sophisticated, which is synthesize this voice at the encoder and compare with the original and try to correct it. So that's actually looking ahead to what the next approach will be. With this vocoder approach, the speech is intelligible at these low rates, but not very natural. So it's not like talking to someone on the telephone. And increasing the bit rate doesn't help very much. You can throw more bits to try to describe these parameters a bit more accurately, but it reaches the limits of this model and doesn't give very high quality. It has been used particularly in military applications. The military like to keep very low bit rates because then it's easier to hide those signals in noise. And maybe it's more important that you understand the message to fire the rocket rather than being able to recognize exactly who's talking, as long as it's an authorized command, I suppose. Why LPC? That's the linear predictive coder, which has this form. That's the filter that we use to synthesize or simulate the vocal tract. And it's essentially just a recursive filter like that. And it, depending on the choice of parameters, there, we get these peaks in frequency response, and these are the formants that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so vocoders work, but they're fairly limited, and we can take this more sophisticated approach, an analysis synthesis or hybrid coder, based on the same technique. So recognize that's those same words, analysis synthesis. So we are analyzing the speech and synthesizing it, but we're doing it in a corrective loop in this case. So we use a bit more sophisticated excitation, but we have this closed loop approach. So we modify the excitation signal and the filter parameters until the synthesized speech is a good match to the original before we send our parameters. And so I'll show you what that looks like. The idea is that the encoder looks like this now. So we used to just have, just a second. Right, we used to just have this. Yeah, essentially. But now we are synthesizing some speech, comparing it with the input, and then detecting the error signal, weighting it according to what's the most important errors, and there's an error minimization algorithm that decides how to modify this this speech synthesis. Actually, that should go there as well, right? We need to be able to modify the filter parameters as well. The decoder, of course, is simpler. It doesn't have this comparison and this feedback approach. So we just need to take those two components and synthesize the speech according to this minimum error these minimum error parameters that we've extracted.
So what do we send to the encoder, to the decoder?
Again, it's a set of parameters that describe the excitation at in each time window and the filter parameters that apply. But I'll show you that in a second. So there have been a few different types of excitation that have been developed over the years since this approach was first introduced. The first approach was just to define a series of pulses independently, but as you might expect, that requires quite a few bits because you've got to effectively got to define, if this is these are the pulses, you've got to define time and amplitude for each pulse, right? So a less accurate but more bit rate efficient approach was to assume that the pulses were regular, and so we just have to define the first one of these pulses, and therefore we assume the rest are periodic in the same time interval, and then we just have to specify the amplitude of each of these. Right, so that's and these different excitation approaches have been used in different generations of mobile phone, actually. But what is done these days is and where all the action is in a family of approaches called code-excited linear prediction, where instead of defining these pulses in communication from the encoder to the decoder, we have a code book of a whole set of different excitation signals, and what is sent from the encoder to the decoder is an index into this code book. And there are lots of variations on this general approach, but we're not going to look at those details. We're just trying to get a high-level view. So the KELP coder looks something like this. We have, instead of sending an excitation signal and the filter parameters are sent as normal, but we have this code book index now. And there are actually a couple of different code books. So there's a fixed code book, so kept for a relatively long term. And we choose which of those excitation signals is the best for this particular frame of our voice. We send there's a gain parameter, so how loud effectively or how large a signal is required for each segment. But we also look for periodic components in the speech and take an excitation signal and store it in an adaptive code book. Right? So if an excitation has been useful at a particular time and it's periodic, then it's found to be an efficient way to encode it, to store that excitation signal in this adaptive code book, the recent excitation signals, and then we have another possible index into this one as an alternative. Right. So the code is becoming a little bit more complicated, but it's found to be quite efficient. When we build that synthesis into the full feedback loop, it looks like this. So this is our speech synthesis. We again go through these stages of weighting the noise, the algorithm to try to minimize the error by adjusting the excitation, the gain, the filter parameters and so on. And so this, we go around this loop several times for each little segment of voice until we hopefully have minimized this error. And then we have a set of parameters here that we can send to the decoder. Okay. So how do they perform in the end? Well, this is a bit of a generalization, grouping several encoders together, but it gives a good view of their performance. So let's first think about, or look at this one, the waveform encoder. So if we've got 64 kilobit per second speech, we get good quality, excellent quality, because apart from the limitation of bitrate, of bandwidth, the fact that it's a 4 kilohertz or 3.5 kilohertz telephone signal, you can't improve on the quality of just directly sampling at 8 kilohertz. So that's what we're doing. We can use more efficient encoders as a more efficient waveform encoders. So they're the adaptive predictive coders, the ADPCM that we saw earlier. And we can use that to drop the bit rate, but the quality also drops as well, as you see. And we can't really effectively use it below about 12 kilobits per second or so. So, okay, what can we do? The first alternative we looked at was the vocoder, where we just synthesized speech and don't try to do any adaptive processing. And as you see, we can effectively encode speech right down to very low bit rates, but even for high bit rates, the quality doesn't improve. Right? This is a bit of a subjective scale, but as you see, even with high bit rates, we don't get good quality speech. And then the hybrid codecs provide a midpoint where the quality of the speech is not quite as good as, of course, the uncompressed voice here, but we're able to get reasonable quality, somewhere between fair and good, at quite low bit rates, 4 to 16 kilobits per second, for instance. And so that's why this has been the focus of voice coding for a very wide range of applications, including, of course, our mobile phones. Right? Our mobile phones use variations on this AKELP, on the KELP coding approach. What else can we do to reduce the bit rate? Well, one thing we can do in the case of speech, again, remembering that we're focusing on the source of our signal and taking advantage of its characteristics, is we can suppress coding when there's silence. Because if we're in a conversation, telephone application, or Skype call or something similar, teleconference, then not everyone is talking all of the time. Right? So we can take advantage of that. In fact, typically in a conversation, a telephone conversation, we speak for about 40% of the time. The other person at the other end is talking for about 40% of the time, and the missing 20% is when we're handing off, effectively. We say something and then there's a bit of a pause before the other person responds. So when there's no speech, it doesn't seem to make much sense sending bits. Right? So that's what this silence suppression is, and you can think of it as being a very simple form of variable bitrate coding. Right? So when there is a voice, when there's speech, we encode it. When there's no speech, we don't code anything. It's a little bit like conditional replenishment in video coding. Right? If the change in the frame is small, we just don't encode it. If the change in the frame is large, then we do. So there are two components to a silence suppression system. The second one may not be quite so obvious. The first one is we, of course, need a voice activity detector, whatever you call it. We need to detect when there is voice and turn the coder on when it is, and then turn it off. We have to set some thresholds there, and the sensitivity of those thresholds are important because it determines whether we either leave the voice coder encoding, even though it's really only noise, or if we make it too insensitive, then we get front-end clipping, which means we start to say a new word and the first part of it gets lost. Yeah? So if the voice activity detector was too insensitive, we might chop off the front bit, and if it's too sensitive, then we might turn on the speech coder, even though it's just this noise stuff either side. So that seems straightforward. That would provide the means to suppress silence and reduce the bit rate. But the interesting and not so obvious component that we need is what's called comfort noise generation. Because if we just turn off the speech completely, so it's dead silent in between people saying something on the phone, then the just human reaction is to think, oh, I've been disconnected. Right? There's nothing on the line. And so to get around that, we actually just fill the gap with static noise, just synthesized noise during the quiet moments. It might not sound noise-like, but it's at a low enough level that doesn't sound like shh, right? But there's something there, so it feels like we are still talking to someone. And but during these periods of silence, we still need to send sort of synchronization signals and to tell the other end that we're still alive. But it's a very low bit rate. Okay, and the noise, of course, is synthesized at the decoder. The encoder doesn't need to send anything. Okay. So, how do we, or what are the quality metrics that are important for speech, reproduced speech? A couple of them are any echo that's present and end-to-end delay. If we're talking about a conversational application, and this came up with delay in video as well, then clearly the end-to-end delay is going to be important, right? Otherwise, the full round-trip delay is so long that we say something, we expect a response, and it doesn't come, so we think they didn't hear us, so we talk again, and we talk over one another. You've all had the experience, I'm sure. Before we deal with that, though, let's just talk about echo. So echo is a particular problem with for conversation, and it needs to be cancelled out if it exists. If there's some way that the my speech that I say somehow gets fed back in and I hear it as an echo, it can be highly disturbing to conversation. So if it's present, we really need a very short delay. If we can remove any echo, or there is no echo, then the one-way system delay can be up to about 200 milliseconds. I'll show you a plot in just a second. But that can be quite challenging to keep that the delay that low, right? The examples where it can be a problem are listed. Satellite links is fairly obvious. We've got about a quarter of a second delay to get up to and back from a geostationary satellite. If we've got a conference bridge, so multiple people are connecting in to a central bridge device that decodes, combines the speech or analyzes the speech to decide who's talking, and then sends another signal out to all the participants, then that multiple decoding, mixing, recoding introduces extra coding delay, and so conference bridges can be a problem. And voice on IP can be a problem because we are compressing to a low bit rate, then we have to gather up enough bytes to put into a packet. So we've got this packetization delay, and we have exactly the same buffering delay that we discussed with regard to video. There are a number of components in the full one-way system delay. One is the algorithmic delay. So what do we mean by that? It means just the fact that we are doing. Sorry. Well, yes, but it's not influenced by the processor speed. So the fact that we are doing something like this means that there's we have to go around this loop, for instance, and so that takes particular time, or we have to gather a certain number of samples before we can do the analysis. So no matter how fast the processor is, we've got this fundamental, unavoidable algorithmic delay. Then there's the processing delay, which can be made a bit faster if we have a faster processor or a better way of organising memory or something like this. And then there's the communications delay, and that can be a problem in this sort of situation, or when we are packetizing and we've got congestion in routers and so on. We can do subjective testing using people talking on handsets to one another, having a conversation, and we can adjust the delay, and they can indicate how disturbing that delay is. Is it noticeable at all? Is it noticeable but I can still hold a conversation, or is it so disturbing that the conversation becomes impossible? And this is the sort of general result that we get. Don't worry too much about this scale. The important thing, of course, is how the satisfaction drops off. And what we see here is that for most users being satisfied with being able to hold a conversation, the delay needs to be less than about 200 milliseconds. Note how it's defined, mouth to ear delay. Right? So we've included everything in the one-way path, from the microphone to the reproduction in the earbuds or headphones or loudspeaker or whatever. And if the delay goes out another 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds, then it severely affects the satisfaction of the connection. So this is why we need to be careful to minimize that end-to-end delay in a conversational service, and why, if the voice coding introduces a delay of, say, 150 milliseconds, then it allows very little extra budget for packetizing things, for congestion and queuing in buffers or routers, and for propagation. Okay. So that we end up with a delay budget that we need to manage. How much delay is actually introduced by the coders? Well, for waveform coders, you might not be surprised to see that the delay is very low, because we're effectively just sampling and maybe doing a little processing in a loop in the case of the predictive coders. So it's just a few milliseconds. And so it's pretty easy, except in those situations such as the satellite connection, it's pretty easy to achieve the end-to-end delay objective. But with these more complicated KELP coders, the hybrid coders, then the encode and decode delay is around 50 to 100 milliseconds. So that's about half of our budget. Our delay budget is gone. There are low delay versions. You can think of ways to optimize and speed things up. For instance, if we take we're trying to characterize, for instance, the appropriate filter parameters here, but maybe we use the parameters that were extracted from the time sample before, right, on the assumption that they don't change too much from one sample to the next. Then that can save us time. So there are low delay versions of those coders, down around 10 milliseconds or so. Okay. So before we leave speech, let's just talk about wideband speech coding, which has emerged over well, more than recent years. There have been some applications of wideband speech for quite a few years. And this comes from an attempt to just make speech a little bit more natural. Narrowband speech came from the 100-year history of telephony, which really we inherited because in the earliest days of telephony, they wanted to reduce the bandwidth as much as possible because of the electronics and the need to try to get lots of voice channels in a very limited spectrum. And so the trade-off, or the best balance, was found to be to limit telephony to around 200 or 300 hertz up to about 3.5 kilohertz. And if we simply take voice and filter it to that range, then we end up with something that we can tell is distorted, as you know, right? This telephone speech doesn't sound completely natural. But there's enough of the energy from the speech that A, we can tell who is speaking, and B, we get a highly intelligible reproduction. But in some applications, we want more natural speech, and so, for instance, well, actually, can you think of any particular applications? Where might we want more natural speech than sort of low bandwidth telephony?
Music.
Yeah, well, that's even more challenging, but I'm thinking particularly speech applications. It's not so obvious, actually. Well, you know, when I tell you of one or two, you'll say, "Oh, well, yeah, I could have thought of that." But so one of them is in video conferencing, where you know, for some reason, it's a kind of psychological thing, I suppose. If you're seeing the person and you have highly degraded speech, it just doesn't seem very natural. It's not as if you're speaking to them directly. But maybe a more common one that we've experienced without really thinking about it might be in a radio station case, where the host of the radio show, you know, for instance, in the morning program where they're switching over to the guy who gives the weather report, or the guy who gives the financial report or something, they don't want to switch between the high quality, say on an FM radio station in particular, the high quality of the announcer in the studio, and then we switch over to a connection from the Weather Bureau, which would be over a telephone line. It just it doesn't sound all that good. So if we have a wideband speech link to the Weather Bureau, then it sounds as if the weather guy is in the studio as well, and so it's just a more, you know, sounds like a higher quality production. And so for many years they have had high rate, high bandwidth links between radio stations and the Weather Bureau for exactly this purpose. More recently, some telephone companies and handset manufacturers have offered high quality or HD voice on mobile phones, even though it's highly compressed. The analog signal is wider than this 3.4 kilohertz, and typically up to around 7 kilohertz. Why 7 kilohertz? Because I haven't got an example, but if you plotted the spectrum of voice, pretty much all the energy of the signal is included in that 7 kilohertz. A singer, of course, would get higher frequencies, but when with typical normal speech, you're within that range. So, typically 50 to 7,000 hertz. By Nyquist, of course, we have to sample at a higher sample rate, so instead of 8 kilohertz, it's more like 16. And to maintain higher quality, we need more than 8-bit sampling as well, and typical number is 14, so 14 bits for the sampling. So you do those numbers, multiply them together, and you get 224 kilobits per second uncompressed. But we can encode wideband speech using exactly the same techniques as narrowband voice, just with different parameters. Okay, so this is a bit of a summary. I certainly don't expect you to memorize any of this stuff, but I just wanted to give you a view about some of the state-of-the-art AKELP coders, the ones that are using the more sophisticated algorithms we've looked at. That might seem a jumble of parameters and non-obvious standardization numbers and acronyms, but we can look at them at all of this information in a couple of different categories. So the first one is just narrowband voice. So it's an AKELP coder. Its AMR is adaptive multi-rate. That's what it stands for. So it actually switches between different rates according to what bit rate is available over a mobile channel. And the second one, the second red dot point, is wideband voice. So now we're going out to 7 kilohertz. Again, a multi-rate solution, so it switches between a number of different rates depending on what's available. And then there's this AMR wideband plus, which tries to extend the representation of sound beyond just speech. So if it's speech, if it detects that it's speech, it'll switch in an AKELP coder. If it detects that it's music, then it does something else like a transform coder. It's not very different in principle to what we've seen with images. This parametric stereo thing we will meet later on, so don't worry too much about it. So this one coder, which is not really one coder, it switches between different modes, but it can be used for speech at low rates or up to 48 kilobits per second for stereo music. Okay. So that gets us through that first category of speech, so where we have this important knowledge. We know that the source of our signal is voice. We have studied the anatomy and we've studied the signals, and we know something about how voice is produced, and we can synthesize it. And if we can synthesize it, then we can go through all those processes to exploit the structure and reduce the bit rate and still maintain reasonably good quality, as long as it's voice. Right? Doesn't work too well if you try to put music through a KELP coder, but it's fine for voice. So now I'd like to move on. Well, I suggest we take a break now. Right? It's a natural place to take a break, have a little stretch and a drink of water or whatever you like, and then we'll move on and look at how we encode arbitrary sounds. And if we can't exploit the source, what can we exploit? And there are some pretty cool approaches, I think, that we'll look at after the break. So, a few minutes and we'll start again.
Where does this 16 kilohertz come from? Is it
Okay. So
twice as the 7 kilohertz?
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's just Nyquist, it's twice the highest bit, the highest frequency, and then a safety margin for practical filters. Okay.
So then the 40 bits.
That's not. We can't just deduce that. It's a matter of trying to get an appropriate signal to noise ratio. Yeah.
So also
Okay.
for the exam. So what I think is I can dot the questions you ask in the exam.
Sorry? Yeah.
So I can dot the questions. I noticed that with very small distance we can tell the difference, but I think we cannot. The only thing to do is trust you. This is the right question. So I think that between the two distances, you can absolutely see the difference. But within the difference, well, there we can see we can distinguish the pixels for both of them. So this is what I thought in the exam.
Okay, but I didn't understand that was what you were saying. That's why I didn't feel I could give you full marks. I mean,
Because the two numbers are right, yes.
well, you don't actually need this one, right?
Okay, yeah.
But this one's
But
about right.
you asked the minimum, so I calculate two numbers, and then what I thought in the exam is that within the two from 45 to 60 to 85, we can see the difference. But within 45, yeah, we can see the block, we can see the pixel structure for both of them.
Yeah.
So then.
Well, that's true,
Yeah.
but you would still see SD as better quality.
This is a large pixel for SD and
Yeah.
small pixel for SD.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
As far as its structure, is that?
Yeah, structure.
What is it? Okay. All right. I see what you meant.
Yeah. But that's fine. It's just it's less than 1 point. If we,
Yeah, no,
yeah, that's fine. Just see if any chance.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay. No, I accept that was my error in the question, but I hadn't quite interpreted what you meant before. So just leave it with me. I'll fix it. Okay. Thank you.
This part, maybe I didn't explain. This page
Yeah.
is just the 1 pixel height.
Right. It seems very big for a pixel. Too good.
Because I think the resolution of this is all the iPad, the screen, all the pixels, and the horizontal pixels is 2048,
Yeah.
vertical is here. So I just this diagonal.
Oh, that was one. Sorry.
The diagonal
Yeah.
belonging to this, and I just use this equation to calculate every 1 pixel's height of 1 pixel. So this is a 1 pixel is 2 millimeter, and then I just calculate distance from.
So H is, oh I see, okay. H is the separation between pixels. So why did you get such a... the answer so large? It should be, it should be, this is about 25 centimetres, then this height will be about 14 or 15. So if you divide 14 or 15 centimetres by 1536, it should be much smaller than 2 millimetres. Shouldn't it? Maybe it's just, I mean, you didn't show the working here, maybe you're out by an order of magnitude or 2. It should be 0.01 centimetres. So okay, that's not so important. So now I understand what you've done, but the calculation and your answer is right here. Didn't what's happened here? That you-
Just when you don't understand the line, in the example of the slides, you just display the screen and I don't understand why I still reached the last one.
Okay, but you just described to me what it means. It's 576 lines. Oh no, that's all that. It means that we look at. You should have asked that in the test. Our SD picture array has 576 rows or lines of pixels in the height. And HD has 1080.
What's the difference with even the rows? It's 176, but what's the difference with the pixels?
Well, these are the pixels on the display, but the pixels on this display don't need to correspond to the pixels that are defined in the image. The image can be blown up, can be zoomed, expanded to fill this. In fact, it normally would be. Yeah. So, but. I don't quite understand what's going on here. Because there's no. Oh, I see. So you haven't taken account of this. Oh, right. Okay. So. Okay, so maybe you. I'll add another point or two because then I understand what you've done here. But you haven't got this, and you haven't seen the difference between the SD and HD, and you haven't answered this question about. Yeah. Okay. All right. Leave it with me. I'll give it back to you in a second.
Just a single question. Here I read that the image is more sensitive to people, and you know that how. So
Yeah.
I don't quite know what do you want to know by how.
Well, first of all, I mean, this is a bit difficult to understand how luminance be
Because
more
people's
sensitive.
eyes is more
Yeah,
sensitive.
so the human viewer is more sensitive.
Yeah,
Not
correct.
The, yeah, the luminance is not more sensitive. It's the
Ah,
viewer that's more sensitive.
okay.
But
So my
not-
understanding is correct, but
Your understanding
my
is correct.
writing is not very.
You're right.
Get
it's
to
not,
the point,
Not so
right?
clear. But apart from that, that's not the most important thing. It's not just being more sensitive. It's more sensitive to particular spatial frequencies.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The fact that we are differently sensitive to
Because people's size.
middle
Middle frequency.
frequencies than
Yeah.
high frequencies means that we can represent them differently. That's the whole
Yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah.
But to say that we are
Correct,
more
correct,
sensitive
correct.
without defining that.
Correct,
that-
correct. Because from my understanding, I think it's more sensitive. Yeah, it's high frequency. Yeah, you should understand what but it's
So,
not.
yeah, so I mean, I thought
Okay.
you probably understood it. I mean, I gave you
Oh, yeah,
more
yeah.
than half marks, but
So here you say why? Well,
Yeah,
because
well,
it's separate, so it's
well,
easy
no,
for I understand what you mean. So I need to write down
yeah,
more detailed thing to show my understanding. Right?
Exactly,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right,
yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And you also say that it's easy
Easy
for
for us to
deal
deal
with.
with the color because you separate the luminate and color, so we can deal
Yeah,
with the
but-
color one because the color is not sensitive to
Well, the
people's
important
eyes.
thing
Yeah.
is that we're able to subsample. I mean, that's what we're really wanting.
Yeah,
to do.
subsample. Yeah.
Yeah, but you haven't said that. You've just said.
So I don't know to carry less bit because I didn't write because the subsampling, so we can carry
Yeah,
we can
well,
carry the less bit.
Say it, please. I mean, you can carry less information
Because of the
without-
subsampling. Yeah. That's what I mean. So
Please,
So,
write-
can I
please write.
request, can you just put some solutions and what is really expected in that?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess they'll be very brief. But
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So it's the point that you require in the answer.
Yeah.
Just take the bold points.
All right. Okay. Giving me homework. I don't know about that.
Yeah. Certainly, we are very disappointed. This works actually.
Okay. All right. Okay, we better start again.
Got a feeling the microphone was muted for the whole time that I was talking in the first part. So sorry about that. Okay. Sounds a bit better? It does. So I've already introduced this. We've got... now let's think about that other major category of audio. Not necessarily voice, but all those other high quality applications like music, surround sound, cinema, right, where the source of the sound could be any sort of arbitrary signal. We just want to try to reproduce anything that the human ear could perceive. How can we do that? Well, the first thing we can do is simply the waveform coding thing. So that's easy. We understand it, so it won't take very long to look at it. But that's an obvious thing that we can do. But we're not taking advantage of any knowledge about how the sound is produced or heard. So if we can't, I'm preempting some slides that are coming, but if we can't exploit knowledge about the source of the signal, maybe we can look at the destination, right, the receiver. So just knowing something about human hearing might give us some clues about how we can reduce the bit rate to exploit those characteristics. And that's what we actually will be doing in these topics. Before we then go on and have another little bit of a sort of a journey through history of some of these important coders that we are reasonably familiar with now. And then we'll look at some approaches to be able to sacrifice a bit of quality, but to significantly reduce the bit rate of even these systems. So let's do this a little bit more formally. Now we don't have this restriction that the source is just voice. It could be music, it could be sound effects, it could be natural sounds, whatever. So with an arbitrary source, we can't take advantage of our source characteristics. So we have two approaches. Basically, we can just try to reproduce the waveform, and as I said, we'll look at this very briefly, or we can exploit characteristics of the ear or the ear-brain system, or formally it's the psychoacoustic system. And there are these two characteristics that we will look at. This psychoacoustic masking, I'll introduce what that's all about, and then we'll look at how we perceive directions of sound. And that also gives us some opportunities to reduce the bit rate. Okay, so the straightforward way of coding arbitrary sounds is just to reproduce the waveform. And we can do that losslessly, essentially losslessly, apart from the quantization. So in the case of CD, for instance, I think we've looked at these parameters before. A CD is lossless. It is simply PCM coded audio. The sampling rate is 44.1 kilohertz, which is a bit more than twice 20 kilohertz, right? Makes sense from the Nyquist point of view. The choice of 44.1 is kind of interesting. I'll talk about that in a second. 16 bits sampling for each, 16-bit quantization for each sample. That's to get a high signal-to-noise ratio. And of course the two channels for the stereo. So we multiply those numbers together and we get 1.41 megabits per second, which is just under the sort of 1 times standard rate of writing onto a compact disc. Yeah, 44.1 kilohertz. Where does that come from? That's a strange number. In fact, it's without wasting time going into the details. The CD was developed back in the probably throughout the 70s and early 80s, I think. Would that be right? Something like that. And in the development of these systems, the researchers and standardization bodies that got together and tried to compare their results had to record their bit streams on something. Right? And today it's easy, right? We've got hard disks that can easily read and write these sorts of bit rates and not be limited by the amount of storage present. Not so in those days. In those days, the best way of recording a high bit rate and therefore high bandwidth signal was to use a video recorder. So they made their digital bit stream, audio digital bit stream, look like a video signal and then recorded it onto a video recording machine. And when you go through the maths, and I'm not sure, I don't actually know what the precise details are, but when you go through the maths and you try to find an appropriate bit rate that works on both an American recorder at their frame rate, video frame rate, and a European recorder at their frame rate, it turns out that 44.1 kilohertz works. So that's why that kind of strange number. And no, you're not supposed to memorize that for the exam. There are lossless audio coders that have been defined based on just PCM coding. So there's the free lossless audio codec, if anyone's into high quality audio and distribution over the net. That's a common format. Apple has a lossless audio coder that they use between devices with AirPlay. Right? So when you use AirPlay to play audio from your iPhone on some other device, say a high quality receiver, it actually puts it in this Apple lossless format and transmits it in that way. And it also comes as a high quality option for iTunes. And the encoding methods are not sophisticated. We're familiar with them. It's just predictive coding and entropy coding. So entropy coding is just a variable length coding like Huffman coding or arithmetic coding. DVD audio. So this is not the soundtrack of a DVD video disc, but its use of the DVD. We talked about this, didn't we? Did we or not? No? Yeah, but the use of the DVD disc just for music. Did we talk about that? No, okay, sorry. So it's not so common here in this country. I'm not sure which countries it is popular in, but people with an interest in having very high quality audio have used just the fact that a DVD stores a lot of data, 4.5 gigabytes more or less, at a high interface rate, around 10 megabits per second. And so they've used it just for high quality audio. So they can store multi-channel with high sampling rates and highly accurate quantization up to 24 bits. And the appropriate combinations can be streamed onto or off the disk at around 9.6 megabits per second, which is close to the limit for a DVD. And the compression that's used is a thing called Meridian Lossless Packing, MLP. So what's MLP? It comes from a company called Meridian. That's why that's where the name comes from. It's nothing very sophisticated, but it's a combination of a few different techniques to reduce the rate without compromising the quality, so it's lossless, hence the middle.
Lossless doesn't have quantizer or something?
Apart from the sampling here, this this limited number or finite number of bits that are used in the quantizer, so that's generating the signal that we are then going to encode and compress. If there's no quantizer after that, then there's no loss, and that's the case in this case. So what are these techniques? The first one, this thing called bit shifting, is just recognising that for some segments of the audio, you won't use the full dynamic range of your 24 bits, for instance. So if you have a part of, this is time, if some of the audio is relatively quiet down here, and then you've got some peaks, and then it's quiet over here, then there might be several, and you're representing this using a 24-bit word, right? They're not all ones. That's supposed to be separating out the 24. Anyway, so for all of this segment of time, the first bits might all be 0 because it's a very small magnitude. So rather than keep on sending 24-bit words with 00000 at the start, we dynamically change the range of that is represented. So over this segment of the audio, maybe we only use 18 bits or something like that, and then only use the wider range when we have to. The second dot point, matrixing, is combining common components. So if we have a multi-channel surround sound system, then it can be that the signal in some of those channels is very similar. So rather than code them 5 times, if we are in a 5-channel system, we can analyse the signal. Where there are common components, we can encode them just once with an indication of where they come from. And then there are the obvious things like doing predictive coding and entropy coding. So that combination of tools is used in this Meridian lossless packing thing. And if you go to Wikipedia, that's what this is copied from, and look at Meridian lossless packing, you'll see where it's applied. And so you see it's used for the audio track in Blu-ray discs, and it's used in this DVD audio, but it's not in DVD video. We need higher compression than MLP can give us, and we'll look at how that coding is done. And that's not a surprise, right? Because here we've compressed the audio, multi-channel audio, highly accurate samples, up to 24 bits per sample, but the audio alone is 9.6 megabits per second. So if we're trying to get video on as well, there's just no space. So it doesn't have a role here. We have other techniques that we'll talk about. Okay, so that's the boring bit out the way, just trying to do waveform coding. Now let's talk a little bit about the psychoacoustic system and some of its interesting characteristics. So we need to start looking at the properties of the ear and the ear-brain system. So more anatomy diagrams, and of course you're not supposed to remember any of those names. What's interesting about the audio, the psychoacoustic system, is that how it behaves in a frequency sense. So we can look at the threshold of audibility. So what does that mean? It means that if we put someone in a quiet environment, maybe with headphones on, and we play sounds to them at different frequencies, then we are differently sensitive to them in this similar kind of analogous way to how we are differently sensitive to different spatial frequencies in vision. So interesting kind of observation is that our human senses effectively do a frequency decomposition, right? They actually, because we are differently sensitive to different frequencies in both vision and sound. Anyway, so we put our subject in a quiet environment and play just one frequency, just one pure tone to them, a sine wave, at different frequencies, and we turn down the level until they say they can't hear it anymore, or more likely we turn it up until they say, oh yes, I heard something then. And we find that that threshold of audibility is a curve that varies somewhat. It might not look like it's varying a great deal, but that's you know, a 30 dB range just over this this set of frequencies, which is not insignificant. So that's all very well. We accept that. You know, maybe there's something we can do there to exploit that variation. We could explore, you know, whether we need to encode these frequencies at with the same fidelity as these ones or something. But there's something more interesting that occurs. So we've got this curve. We know that if a single tone is played loud enough that it exceeds this threshold of audibility, then we can hear it. So we might expect that anything that exceeds that threshold of audibility is audible. So if we had one single sinusoid and it was quantized with a certain number of bits, as you see, 16-bit here, 24-bit here, then where there's the tone, it exceeds the threshold of audibility, and we hear it. So that's fairly straightforward. However, things get more interesting when we have multiple frequencies present, and then we have this phenomenon which is called frequency masking or simultaneous masking. So what's this all about? We have a single tone, it exceeds this threshold of audibility, so we hear it. We've got another tone played at another frequency nearby, it exceeds the threshold of audibility, we should hear that too, right? But we don't. And we don't because the louder tone actually distorts this curve at frequencies nearby. Okay? So the fact that this one exists means that this one is inaudible at that particular level. If we increase the level of this second tone, the masked one, it's called masked, then maybe we would hear it, but as drawn there, we don't. So you can see immediately where this is going. If we can't hear it, then why encode it? No? So to show some actual plots, this is a bit artificial to show the concept. The picture quality is pretty awful, but we can see the result. So here we've got this higher amplitude signal at 800 Hertz, and it has the effect of masking this sound, this one at 1 kilohertz. If this 1 kilohertz signal was not 1 kilohertz but 2 kilohertz, it would be out here and it would be above the modified audibility threshold and we would hear it. But where it's shown there at those particular levels, we wouldn't. It would be masked. Okay. The effect of this masking is dependent on the signal level though. So as we increase the signal level for our masker, the effect, the influence on this threshold of audibility extends to out to a wider range of frequencies. So where, if I just go back to the previous slide, you can see that if we played this level at 2 kilohertz, it would have been easily audible. But with the increased amplitude here, then this masking effect extends over a wider range of frequencies, and that tone, even though this is a higher amplitude, would not be heard. And if we keep on going, we increase that the level of our masker much higher, then we see that the effect extends right out to effectively to the limits of human hearing. And so even frequencies that would have been heard from with the lower level are effectively masked at higher levels. So there's the basis for some data compression, right? We've found that if we can model this in some way, if we can somehow characterize this this masking effect and identify frequencies that are present in the source signal that would not be heard when reproduced because of the masking effect, then let's not encode them. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. But this masking effect gets a little bit more complicated when we look at what happens in the time domain, right? Because it's not an instantaneous thing. So if our masker tone, what's happening here? We've looked at the this curve is supposed to indicate the change in the audibility threshold at a particular frequency. Let me see if I've got a... Yeah, let's just have a look at this one briefly. So the what's being shown here, at this particular frequency, so 3 kilohertz, when this masker tone is turned on at this point, then that threshold increases all the way up there, right, which corresponds to that line, and then after the masker is turned off, then it fades back. That's what we're trying to show. Does that make sense? Yeah, so we've kind of got another dimension there. But the interesting thing is that it's not instantaneous. So this bit is not a big surprise perhaps. So we turn off the masker tone at this instant, and for some tens of milliseconds that masking effect persists. So that's our psychoacoustic system readjusting or whatever. So again, opportunities for compression. The masker tone has ceased, but its effect continues for a while. If during these tens of milliseconds a signal would still be masked, then we can remove it. We don't need to send it. What's really curious is this bit, right? You can see what's happening here. We actually have a masking effect which occurs before the start of the masking. It's called pre-masking. I would love to be able to tell you what the anatomical, biological process is, but and maybe it's entirely psychological, that we simply are overwhelmed, not at a signal processing level, but at an interpreting level or something. I'm not qualified to talk about it. But it's just an interesting phenomenon that when we have a loud masker tone that starts at this particular time, then it actually has the effect of masking other frequencies for some short time beforehand. Okay, so yeah, it seems non-causal, but we engineers can kind of think of can kind of model this, right? We can imagine this masker tone following one path through the brain, and sorry, well, maybe a loud tone takes a shortcut, right? So, or something like that. As I say, I'm not sure of the mechanism, but we just look at it from the signal processing point of view, and we see that it happens. And so, how can we take advantage of it? Okay, so that's what we're trying to we're looking at, this extra dimension of the temporal relationship. And what that means is that if we look at a 3D plot, hopefully that can be interpreted. So we've got the increasing frequency along this axis. So a slice through that plane is this sort of plot, yeah. And but we have the we have the time varying approach going in this direction as well. So what this is showing is that for a particular frequency, the masker frequency, we go along for some time without any masking, then we turn it on at a particular instant. It's sustained for a while, then turned off, and the masking effect occurs for different frequencies either side, but it also has this pre-masking effect in time and a post-masking effect afterwards. So everything underneath this curve is masked, this frequency time curve. Does it make sense to interpret that diagram? Okay, so great stuff. How do we take advantage of it? Well, it has led to the basic form of what's called a psychoacoustic or a perceptual encoder. The first important instance of which is MP3. MP3 is based on this. So we'll talk about how that came about later. So how does it work? It's all in the frequency domain, right? So we have our input audio signal. So this is a very generic sort of implementation, but we put it through a filter bank to split it up into lots of different frequencies. And we're going to decide how to allocate bits and to encode different channels out of that filter bank according to our model of psychoacoustic hearing. So we take an FFT of the audio at the same time, and we develop this complicated time and frequency based model of how we think the ear will behave at certain frequencies, which frequencies it will hear and which frequencies it won't. And this is the one that drives this allocation of bits. And then once we've quantized and decided which channels we want to preserve, they then go on to bitstream formatting. What does bitstream formatting mean? It just means assigning code words to the information that we wish to preserve. Now, the interesting part about this, or an interesting part about this masking is is twofold, really. We've already said that this presents opportunities for compression because this mask E tone need not be encoded, right? Because it's not audible. But also we know that anything under this curve is not audible. So if we quantize the signals that we do want to keep, we can quantize them at an accuracy that might generate quantization noise, but so long as that quantization noise is also under here, then we won't hear it. Okay, so
We know which frequency gonna mask, but the less frequency masks the bigger frequency.
no, yes, not the higher frequency, but the lower magnitude. Right? So the higher magnitude signal masks the lower magnitude signal, and it could be here. Right? It could be lower in frequency, it could be higher in frequency. Interesting that the effect is greater for higher frequencies, though.
But in frequency domain also that starts before.
Yes, yeah, indeed. The masking, this distortion of this audibility threshold occurs for frequencies below and above the masker. So, if we think about one particular frequency band in that previous diagram, this diagram, so one particular frequency band coming out of that filter bank, we're about to quantize it. Okay. What happens when we do that? The original signal is the green one. We are representing it with a finite number of bits, so it has limited accuracy, so we're actually represented by the red signal, which has these limited, restricted levels. Okay? And the difference is the blue, right? So this is our quantization noise, right? So we want to make sure that that quantization noise is not audible, of course, but it won't be audible so long as we keep it below the masking threshold. So, and provided it is below the masking threshold, we can save more bits where possible. So we save some bits by just not encoding frequencies that we can't hear, and we save other bits by quantizing the signals that we do keep in such a way that the quantization noise is as large as we can tolerate. But we still can make it, hopefully, if our model works, we can still make it inaudible. So let's see how that works. Let's see how this perceptual coder works, what its operation is. So first thing we do is we analyse our signal frequency domain representation, and we apply our psychoacoustic model. So this is the clever bit. This is the bit that the companies like Philips and Sony and so on have put a lot of effort and research into, and the result is an estimate of how this masking function applies given the frequencies that are present. Okay, so all of the frequencies will have a different effect on one another, so it's quite a complicated thing to model, but we come up with this curve. Then we compare the masking function with the signals that are actually present in each of our bands. So we've split our signal up into lots of frequency bands, and this is how they compare with the masking function. So anything that is above the threshold here needs to be encoded, right? Anything that's below the masking function, like this one, can be dropped. Right? We don't need to allocate any bits to represent that particular frequency band because the signal level is below the masking function. But the quantization bit, oh sorry, this is everything that's below the threshold, so we don't encode them. But the bands that we do keep here, we quantize in such a way that the quantization noise is as much as we're prepared to tolerate, just as long as it's less than the masking threshold, and then it too will not be audible.
So why we quantize it less than the threshold?
Let-
Why we have to quantize those audible one less than the threshold? I think it has to be under that threshold.
Sorry, no, we're not taking this signal and quantizing it down there. What I'm saying is that this signal here is this green one here. And when we quantize it, we represent it with this red signal, and the quantization noise that's introduced is the difference between them, which is the blue one. So long as that blue one sits down here, right? As long as that blue signal, the quantization noise, doesn't exceed that masking threshold, then we shouldn't hear it, in theory. Okay. So, as you might expect, it's a kind of difficult thing to model, but if we succeed, then we can save a lot of bits because we can throw away this information that we can't hear, and we can introduce quantization noise in a controlled way such that we can't hear it. Here are a few sort of guidelines. I don't expect you to memorize this stuff, but just to understand what's going on. It's been found through experience that the difference between the masker and the maskee tone needs to be about 15 dB or so, at least 15 dB or so for the masking to be effective. There is this complex relationship between level and frequency and time, as you might expect, so a lot of effort needs to go into modelling that properly. Interestingly, the masking effect is strongest above the masking tone. We saw that in terms of frequency. So, right, the masking effect is much stronger for higher frequencies than the low ones. So, if we have a relatively low frequency like this one, 800 Hertz, it's going to mask lots of frequencies in the high frequency end, and so there's potential to for this tone to dominate, and we won't hear many of these, so we'll save lots of bits. If we had if this wasn't present, and we had a large signal way up here somewhere, there's much less potential to save bits because the effect is on the largest effect is in the higher frequencies, of which there are fewer. Yeah. What else was on this list? Okay, so now we haven't talked about surround sound, but interestingly, a signal on the left channel may not mask a signal on the right. So even though we've got this model about signal levels, the fact that we hear them differently in the two ears means that the masking effect is not so evident. So it's another thing to be careful of. And we also need to be careful of difference tones. So let's suppose that we have these two tones present. So this is the masker, this is the maskee. We don't hear this one. So from the point of view of the effect of this signal on the audibility threshold, we can throw away the brown tone, right? We don't hear it. But if there are some nonlinearities in the system, we can end up with sums and differences of frequencies. Yeah, and so if that occurs, then there might be right, if there could be a signal here, and the difference between these ones is down here. So the different signal might be audible, even though the original one here might not be. So there's just a need to be a bit careful of that sort of thing as well. Okay. Has anyone considered, though, that there might be an important fundamental assumption that we're relying on for all of this? We're basing our plan to save bits on how the ear perceives the tones that we are reproducing and presenting it to in a loudspeaker or earbuds or whatever, right? But there's something, and the masking effect. This masking effect is subject to the signal level of these different frequencies. So what's missing in what we've considered? I don't think I've asked that question very well. What we haven't taken into account is the listening environment, which is not in our control when we're encoding. Right? So we're in the recording studio, not in the recording studio. We've got a high quality recording and we're encoding it in our bank of encoders or on PCs or whatever, way back in Spotify, right? Generating the bit rate that we're storing on our server, which we're going to stream to our customer or our client, our listener, and our listener is going to decide how high to turn the volume up, or maybe they've got a graphic equalizer and they'll boost some frequencies and reduce other frequencies, and we didn't take that into account when we did our modelling. So to be able to fully exploit these characteristics that we talked about, to know exactly what this masking function is going to look like and which frequencies will be masked and which won't, we really would want to know exactly what the listening environment is, and we can't control it. So so because of this uncertainty, we really need to be very conservative when we're doing this compression, to avoid unmasking of these compression artifacts. Right? In one assumed listening environment, the quantization noise is below the masking threshold, but someone might listen to it on a different environment, boost certain frequencies and reduce others, or turn the volume down to a lower level than we expect, and all of a sudden the quantization noise becomes audible. Right. So here we have the listening environment will be affected by the surface reflections, right? So the frequency response of the room will not be flat. The loudspeaker response will be dependent on particular frequencies. We've got this possibility of an equalizer, or the volume settings that we haven't got under control at the encoding end. So we have the possibility of this unmasking. So what does this unmasking mean? It means that if we've done our encoding assuming this very high masker level, that would mask this tone, which is 25 dB below it. So this one's 25 dB lower power than this one, and it's masked. But if the listener effectively just turns the volume down, then even though this is still 25 dB below this one, the effect on the masking threshold is different at the lower level, and this one is now audible. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. One of the other variables I mentioned there was the loudspeaker response. So it's interesting that, let me just present to you the frequency response as measured on a particular type of loudspeaker. And we can see that for a significant range of frequencies, up to at least 1 kilohertz and beyond, the response is quite flat within a 3 dB range. But if we take exactly the scale is different, but if we take exactly the same speaker and put it in a room, right, so where we have different reflections and different curtains, and the couch or something will absorb and reflect different frequencies, then over that same range of frequencies, then we have a variability of about 10 dB. Right? So again, something that's outside our control when we are doing the encoding. Right. So does the psychoacoustic masking make sense in principle? We'll see how it's applied in particular coders in a little while. Not sure that we'll do that tonight, but anyway. So let's move on and look at another aspect of our psychoacoustic perception, which is this directionality. How do we perceive sounds coming from different directions? Because if we know something about that, that might tell us something about the signals that have to be sent to our 5 or 7 or 9 or however many surround sound loudspeakers we have. How would we encode multiple channels? Well, one obvious thing to do might be to take advantage of the fact that part of the signal might be similar in the two channels. So there's a type of coding or a coding tool that's called MS coding, for mid-side coding. And what we mean by mid-side coding is to switch between two different modes, depending on whether we whether the signals in our two stereo channels, think of these, at least to start with, think of them as just our left and right stereo channels as we have in this room. If the signals in those two channels are relatively different, then we just encode them separately. But if they're similar, then we have an advantage, or we can get an advantage by performing this simple operation. We turn them from left-right channels into mid-side channels, where we add, where the mid signal is the sum of the left and right, and the side channel is the difference. So if you think about that, what's that doing? It's actually decorrelating them, because if the left and right channels are very similar, then this S signal will be very small, yeah, and so we're going to save bits because we won't require very much information to represent it. And we can change that dynamically. So as we proceed through think of a cinema soundtrack, there'll be times when the two stereo channels are reproducing music, which have a range of different instruments will be placed in the right speaker or the left speaker, or some combination. So they'll be potentially quite different. But then there'll be periods in the movie when we've just got dialogue, and so we've got a picture of someone in the middle who's speaking, and we want the signal from each of the left and right channels to be similar, so it sounds like it's coming from the centre. Yeah? So under those circumstances, we might be better off switching to the mid-side version. So this can be used with stereo pairs, and in surround sound systems it can be applied to what are called channel pair elements. So what do we mean by that? Applying them between left and right channels, but also the left and right surround channels that would be ordinarily at the back. But you can't really apply it between, what is it? From your perspective, it's a left surround and right front, right? It doesn't make sense. So that's one tool that we can use, but we can also exploit frequency-dependent behaviour. So that leads to opportunities to combine certain frequencies and encode them just once in some way. So, but to understand that, there's one other thing that we could do, and we'll explore this at the end, is to parametrically describe our multiple channels. What does that mean? It means we can go to the trouble of trying to accurately represent the signal in that speaker and that speaker and that speaker and that speaker, or might not be so accurate, but for a very low rate application, maybe we just have one signal and we say, take that signal and transform it this way for that speaker. So particular signal level, maybe frequency characteristics, and take that signal and transform it slightly differently for this speaker and similarly for the others. So that's what parametric coding means. But that's a very vague description, and I'll come back and talk about that in more detail. But first, let's think about these frequency-dependent behaviours of surround sound. And to explore this, I want to take a maybe kind of strange approach. I want to do a thought experiment with you. So let's just pretend. This will eventually make sense. It might seem a bit bizarre, but anyway. Let's just pretend that we have a challenge. We've got we want to measure the height of water waves. So think of a cylinder, such as is shown in green there, and either side of this cylinder we've got some sensors, some floats or something that tell us the height of the water. And so imagine that sitting on a pier or near the beach or something, and we want to use information from those two instruments, either side of our cylinder there, to determine the direction from which the waves are coming. Right? That's our aim in this thought experiment. And we ask ourselves, and this is what we're ultimately wanting to answer, how successfully can we do that? So how successfully can we tell the direction from which certain waves came, depending on their wavelength? So if the wavelength is substantially longer than the size of our cylinder, what does that mean for measuring the direction? Similarly, if it's comparable, and similarly if they're shorter. And let's consider what information we can obtain from those wave height measurers, sensors, in each of those cases. Okay, so the first of those cases is where the wavelength is substantially longer than the cylinder size. So we can easily picture that, I think. Imagine we're on a pier and we've got a column in the water, like might be supporting the pier. This is the cylinder. We've got a measuring device that can tell the height of the water on either side, but the wavelength is quite long for the water that's coming through. Right? What do you think? How successfully do you think we would be in detecting the direction from which those waves come, and why? I'm not sure if I've succeeded in getting the picture in your mind that I wanted, but think of...
Be able to
We won't be able to recognize
Because, why?
the wavelength is bigger than the size of the cylinder.
Yeah, so effectively, if this wavelength is, if these wave crests are a long way apart, then these sensors that are measuring the height of the water on either side of this, cylinder are moving up and down almost together. Right? It's very difficult to get a difference between the measurements on either side, so as a result it would be very difficult to tell which direction the water is coming from, right? Which direction the wave's coming from. As I say, the whole of the water level around this cylinder would be rising and falling together, yeah, because the wavelength is long. Everyone happy with that? You're possibly thinking, where's this guy going? But this will make sense in a few minutes, I hope. Okay, next case. So now the wavelength is comparable with the cylinder size. What do you think the situation would be now? We can measure these wave heights, and we can take our measurements off and do whatever signal processing we want on it and try to determine what direction the waves are coming from. Could we do it? Could we do it accurately? What do you think?
Yes, I could.
Yeah? Why do you say that?
Because when one side is on the peak, then the other side is on the lowest level.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that thinking. Yeah, I agree. So, so there would be substantial difference between the measurements that we would get on either side here, and so we would be able to tell that depending on the time, for instance, between the peaks and the troughs on these two sensors, we could use that to determine the direction from which the waves came, and we could do it reasonably accurately. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so our third case. Now we've got all our wave fronts are very close together. Our wave crests are very close together. What's the situation now? What do you think?
Not accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, we can tell the difference, but it's not can be accurate.
Right. Why not?
Because if one, like let's say one sensor on the peak and then the other one come in, so it's like
Also at the peak.
Sorry.
One sensor at the peak, other sensor is also at the peak there.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
quite a bit ambiguous.
yeah. Well, I think one way of putting what I think you're talking about is that we will possibly be able to tell a difference between what's measured here and what's measured here, possibly because they're different points on the wave, but we don't know. We can't correlate. We don't know which wave crest is passing by. So, if we have a particular peak arrive here at a particular time, and then a fraction of a second later we have a peak here, our wavelength is so short that we can't tell which one is which. Yeah? So it could have been that the waves were one. I should have drawn another graphic. Could have been that the waves came from here with one wavelength, and then that would explain the time difference. Or it could be that they come from some other direction, but with a second wavelength. Right? So we can't really tell the direction from which they're coming from the time difference, from the phase. Okay, but now think what would actually happen if these waves were passing by this cylinder that was large compared with the wavelength. Would the signal that we get from this be identical to that one but just delayed? Would it? Sorry?
Can you repeat that?
The signal that we get from this sensor, would that be identical to that one, just delayed by some time? We're saying that we can't, just measuring that delay isn't enough to tell us what the wavelength is, because we're not sure, we can't correlate exactly which wave crest we're talking about. But I'm asking a separate question now. I'm saying, is that signal going to be identical to that one, but with a time shift? Yeah. I would say no, because we have a sort of a shadowing effect. right? There would be diffraction of our waves around this object. Imagine a really big object compared with the waves. And so the signal level here is probably lower than there because it gets partly shadowed by the waves moving around this object. Yeah? Maybe I should find a photo of this to illustrate it. But if you think of, well, just imagine, I've got a...
If you imagine it's a wing and you're standing on the side of the building.
Yeah, that's a good example. Even wind effect on one side of a building or another, or perhaps this is the waves on the beach here. This is a beach, and there are waves out here. But suppose there was a breakwater came out here, right? So this is all concrete and stuff. Right? What would the waves look like as a series of waves came along here? Is that we wouldn't see the same height wave around here as we get here, right? As this wave passes by, it doesn't instantly raise the wave height over here. What would actually happen is that there'd be a bit of diffraction around that object, right? And we'd have small height waves here and larger height waves here, yeah? So we're talking about the same sort of situation with our cylinder that's very large compared with the water waves. The signal that we would get here, the height measurement, would not necessarily be quite as high as this, right? Because of this, the fact that the wave would be attenuated a bit before it got here, and that shadowing effect might persist out here. So from a signal processing point of view, what's that telling us? It's telling us that phase is not going to tell us the direction from which the waves came, but the magnitude might. Would you agree? I hope you agree, because this is this is important to where we're going. Okay, so in summary, what have we got? So if our sensors are separated by a distance much less than a wavelength, what did we say? So if the wavelength was very long, we couldn't tell the difference. So we couldn't tell the direction from which the wave's coming, right? So we cannot accurately determine the direction of the source. Okay. And when the distances, the separation of our sensors is comparable with the wavelength, we could get good correlation between our measurements on either side, and we felt that we probably could accurately determine the direction of the source because we have magnitude and phase information available to us. Yeah? But in the third case, when the sensors are separated by a distance much longer than a wavelength, we can detect the direction of the source, but we can only use magnitude. We can't use phase for the reasons we said. Okay, so let's get back to talking about our main subject. What happens if we throw away our cylinders and our wave height sensors and our ocean waves and we substitute them with a head and two ears and surround sound? Right? So we have exactly the same situation. A very low frequency, like 100 hertz, at sea level has a wavelength of about 3.4 meters, much larger than the separation of these two ears, right? So our two ears are doing the pressure sensing. They're only separated by, what, I don't know, 15, 20 centimeters, I don't know. Substantially less than this wavelength. So what does that mean for our detection, our setting up surround sound speakers? Pardon? We can't tell the direction. So if we can't tell the direction from which a very low frequency sound comes, do we need 5 speakers or 7 speakers? Or, no, we don't. We only need one subwoofer, one low frequency effects channel. And it doesn't really matter where it is. It doesn't matter if it's sitting to the right of the TV set or underneath it or underneath the couch or behind here, right? There would be possibly be an issue of the sound level, but the direction from which the sound comes is very difficult to tell. Okay, but and then at the other end, the other extreme, let's look at a 10 kilohertz signal. So do the same calculation, taking account of the speed of sound at sea level. Then the wavelength is 3.4 centimeters. So now that's short with compared with the separation of our sensors. And so remember our conclusion was, yes, we can tell the direction from which it comes, but we can't use phase. We're not sensitive to phase. So what does that mean for a surround sound system? It means that we could, if we have 10 kilohertz or frequencies in the range 10 kilohertz to 15 kilohertz or something like that, then we could faithfully reproduce the magnitude and phase of that signal in each of our surround sound speakers, but why don't we, if we're not sensitive to phase anyway, why don't we just encode it once with some side information to say this is the magnitude in this speaker, this is the magnitude in this speaker, this is the magnitude in this speaker. Because if we're not sensitive to phase, then we don't need to reproduce the phase. Yeah? Okay. So, same conclusions apply about wavelengths, and therefore we can do as I've described. So for low frequency audio, we have difficulty determining the direction of the sound source. And for mid frequencies, we can pinpoint the magnitude and the phase of sounds coming from different directions, so we need to reproduce them all. High frequencies, we can determine the direction of the sound source, but only from the magnitude. So, specifically, in a signal processing sense, how do we take advantage of this? Well, for the high frequencies, there's a technique which is just what I described, actually, but it comes with different names. I'll keep referring to it as coupling. That's the name that Dolby gives to it. DTS, you might have heard of DTS. It's an audio sound system used in the cinema and on DVDs and so on. They call it joint frequency coding. MPEG calls it intensity stereo coding, but it's all the same thing. So the idea is simply that we combine our high frequency information into one signal. We encode it once, but we keep the a measure of the relative power in our multiple channels, and so we maintain the amplitude, but we lose the phase. Yeah. And we've already talked about what we can do with the low frequencies. We only need one low frequency effects channel, or what do you call it? Subwoofer. Only one subwoofer. And so all of our other, the other part of that is, of course, is that the low frequencies, and they're typically below about 120 to 150 hertz, are sent to the subwoofer. All of our other channels don't have to go down that low, so they can reproduce the frequencies above that. So that's why we don't need super low frequency loudspeakers in our other surround sound loudspeakers. So that provides our background for the tools that are for the important tools that are used in these perceptual audio coders. Perceptual psychoacoustic, that means the same thing. And so it's a natural place for a break, and we're approaching 8 o'clock, so why don't we stop there this week. But when we get together next week, we'll start to talk about how these tools are actually used in specific coders, and we'll look a little bit at the similar to how we've done for video. We'll look at the a couple of generations of audio coder and some of the new tools that are added in the more recent audio coders. We won't spend so long on it. We'll finish it in how long will we take? We'll probably take maybe half, maximum half the next lecture to finish off all of the audio. And then once we've done that, we'll look at some clever techniques that have been used to parametrically describe some audio signals and gain some extra bitrate advantage. So, thanks for this evening, and I'll see you next week.
I don't understand why you like
Confused and
But then maybe I didn't know how to explain it, but then I said the human eye is less sensitive to special frequency for commonness and more sensitive for dimness, so we can subsample commonness.
Yeah, well, I sort of thought you understood most of it, which is why I gave you 4 out of 5. But you haven't, nowhere have you said that there's different sensitivity for different spatial frequencies? I mean, you said less sensitive to spatial
Like a
frequencies.
human eye.
Yeah, but you haven't mentioned high spatial frequencies or low spatial frequencies.
Okay.
That's the critical
And then this
thing.
one, I meant like by predictive coding, we sense the difference between the original pictures. We compare with the previous one, and then we send the difference. But here, we send the sub information that the decoder gets a picture, and we just send the
But in the end, you've just said it requires less bits without explaining what we're.
I mean, because we're sending prediction error from the.
Yeah, but we're sending prediction error here as well.
Okay, but
I mean,
I don't know that I have to be.
well, no. The key point is very short. The key point is that motion compensation reduces the prediction error.
Yeah. Because the decoder is getting the picture from the previous one. When
But
we sending only
no.
the-
But that's the case here as well.
Now here at the encoder, we
Yeah.
do the comparison, like we do this one minus this one, and then we send the
Yeah.
difference.
So we.
But more bits we send.
Yeah.
And,
But
yeah.
my concern is you haven't actually explained why there are less bits.
Because of English.
No, it's not. I don't think it is English because.
Because
Both-
here
both
I
of them-
meant
both-
here is like we're sending prediction error, but not prediction error for the difference between the original one and the previous one. We're sending the prediction error for the like if the decoder makes mistake, we just send him.
Yeah, but I repeat, we're doing the same thing here. Right? This is exactly the same from what you've described. Right? We make a prediction. There's an error, and we just send the prediction error to the decoder.
But we send the prediction error for the difference, but for the difference between the main picture and the previous one. But here, the decoder will get the current picture from the previous one because we send the coordinates. Anyway.
Yeah, no, but if you listen to the words you used,
I see,
it's exactly the same. Right?
Yeah.
The difference is that because we're tracking moving objects, we're able to improve the prediction, so it's a better prediction. The prediction error is smaller, and we save bits.
Yeah, anyway. Next time I'll do it. But this one, what about this one? Like when I said that, that's why I put number here because I thought maybe I didn't explain it better. Larger motion vector, more than one. I meant I put number.
Ah, okay.
I mean I meant the numbers, not the range. Here I said the
okay.
value, range of value. But that's why that I put into two
Right.
number. I meant the number, not
Okay.
the. And then here, I mean, smaller blocks provide more accurate, accuracy. I don't know how they are. See, so.
Why would larger blocks be more accurate, more likely to find a match?
Because it's bigger, like it's gonna contain it's bigger block, so the pixel might be in this big block, but more processing.
So, but you're talking about a search area rather
Yeah.
than the size of blocks.
No, I mean if we have the search area. If the block is bigger, then the search area. Is
Not necessarily. They're separate concepts, right? No, it's. If the block is smaller, then we have more of them covering the whole
Yeah.
picture. But then there's a separate decision over what range do we search for each block.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this one is
That's good.
But this one, I mean, you said why or how do you know? How do
Yeah,
I
where
know?
does
I
this
mean,
come from?
I mean, this one is like the equations. You gave it to us. 1 over. It's not. I know how it come from, but
Yeah.
maybe just shortcut. I put
Yeah,
d over h 3.2, but it's
are-
1
okay.
over.
You would understand why I feel
No,
nervous.
it's
because
here. Yeah, I
Yeah,
put it
but-
here,
and
not there. See, that's the equation when you do 1 over 1 over 1080, and then
okay, but put yourself in my position. I'm a
Yeah,
bit nervous
no.
that you've remembered the number 3.2 without having any idea of what it.
No,
where it
I
comes
know
from.
from it
Yeah.
comes, but see, that comes from there. But anyway,
Yeah,
I didn't put
you
like
should-
shortcut.
you
I shouldn't do that.
No, you shouldn't. You
No.
should explain.
And here it says ds. Here 1 over 576 times this times 8. And he said, how do you know? How do I know ds?
Yeah, you haven't calculated it. No.
Because it's like this one, same h. We're using the same h. This one is less than this one. More than this one. I meant it's gonna be more. So that's why I said this one is bigger. Because this one is sorry. This
No,
one
it's-
is
no, it's not a pen.
no, it's not. Yeah, that's yours. Anyway, so this one is 1 over time is I think and you find 29 times h. So
Yeah,
that's,
well,
that's this one.
you're filling it
But
in
yeah.
now, yeah.
No,
But
anyway.
it's okay, different color.
Anyway, I just need to know. Next
Yeah.
time I have to maybe put more information
Yeah,
Same as me, didn't put more
because we're
information.
gonna have to exam later. That's why I'm.
yeah. I know.
This is the same
I don't
format.
want one either.
This is the same format that you will put in the lesson.
Probably. Yeah.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
No
Have a good
worries,
night.
thanks. See you.
Do you want to close the computer first? So it's going to be record all the information into the video.
Yes.
You did?
Yeah. So what did we?
Oh, do you remember last time I discussed with you
Oh,
the
okay.
feature with the
Oh yeah.
IoT?
Okay. Good.
So I have a draft here. So actually, I complete my introduction. So the whole point of my project is to talk about the IoT. Because there's a calculation like the IoT got many devices. If we go into the age of IoT, so
Yeah.
we can many devices connect to a network, right?
Sorry, let me just check. No, I just want to. Let's just move away from the front desk because I don't know what the
Front microphone's doing. I know I've turned this one off.
So my whole point is that to talking about we're going to be have so many devices, IoT devices. So if we let's image if we connect all the devices in the network, so it will give too much pressure on the network. So one way people to upgrade the network, like we're going to 5G, we're going to NG.2, you should know that, NG.2, next generation
Oh, okay. Yeah.
passive network,
Oh yeah.
fiber thing.
Right.
So yeah, people, this one way, but on the other way, we can think about for our multimedia itself, we can maybe using some technology or method to reduce its own size, but still keep the same quality, right?
Yep.
To release the pressures to the network. And then keep.
this is just compression.
Yeah, and keep the same experience for the customer. Yeah, so I hope, but this is my hope as a point. So here I have some section here. So this one last time I discussed with you
what kind of thing you want to look at from the project. So I have some sub-project here to, a subtopic here to discuss the technology or the process, new process method to release the network pressures. And it is all about money itself. Because if we go into the IoT network, all the devices coming up, we got more traffic. So,
So I'm interested in the impact on multimedia things. So this, for instance, the fact that we've got all this traffic means you want to do more video processing on the edge. So this is an important thing. It influences the multimedia system as a result of doing IoT. Similarly here, we've got specifically a multimedia Internet of Things. How is the quality of experience different? And therefore, whatever the approach is that's used here.
yeah, so I'm not sure my subtopic here is that what we want to see. Or
Yeah, this sort of thing is good. I'm not so sure about this one. I mean, it's a specific. Why is that IoT?
okay, because for some of the device, if the technology is going to develop more and more, some device, IoT device, they have the capability to capture a very high quality image. But the IoT device, for the customer or user want to get a benefit from such device, then for the device itself, for the video or image itself, how can we reduce the size or give less pressures to the network? If all the they think about if IoT device capture the high definition video or picture or whatever, and they don't manage the multimedia data in a good way. So, for example, the uncompressed or compressed no good, but quality is no good.
But is this?
So,
but how is this different to, say, YouTube or Netflix providing 4K video? I mean, they still want to reduce the bitrate to take the load off the network. So what's different about the IoT? I guess I'm asking. Maybe there is an answer. I'm not sure. But I'm just wondering what it is, because anywhere where you're using high quality video requires lots of bits. We want to compress to take the load off the network. See what I'm asking?
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying these are particularly interesting. I'm just scanning this quickly, but these are particularly interesting because it's specifically multimedia and the effect on the multimedia of the fact that it's IoT.
So this one, you're going to talk about how the video is going to process, like to manage the data, process in different way to release the.
So that's good. And the fact that we've got multimedia in the Internet of Things, if that pushes a particular different layered processing structure, then that's of interest as well. So
yes. Okay. And also, I'm talking about this one because
energy efficiency.
because the device, some IoT device, they just stand alone. It doesn't have a continuous power into it. They're using battery or something.
So you want to keep coding to minimize the energy use.
So we want to discuss some bits that. So to more doing the efficiency.
So this is good. It's fleshing out sort of what we briefly talked about last week, I think. So
because I'm not sure my track is on the right track or
I
the
think so.
direction.
What I was after was, we know about multimedia. Now we're talking about multimedia in the Internet of Things. What does the fact that it's Internet of Things mean for multimedia? Why is the multimedia different? Well, now you've got some answers. You want to keep the energy down, so maybe you code in specific ways to reduce the energy. We want to, something, I'm not too sure what, but something pressures us to do processing on the edge rather than centrally because it's in the Internet of Things. So this is good. And here,
to control.
To whatever. So we're seeing the fact that we've got multimedia in the IoT is changing what we do or what we can do with the multimedia. That's what I wanted to bring out. So there are some good examples.
And also the last one, I'm not sure. You one is talking about.
Data or sound.
Yeah, because sound is a multimedia, but now there are some guys that got the technology to deliver the data without network, but it can go through sound.
Yeah.
So they think if the IoT device, if they are in the same building, or I mean, for example, in the campus or whatever,
Yeah.
the sound has a distance to deliver the data, but not very far.
Right.
But in a
Is this
range,
ultrasound, is it?
yeah. Sorry.
Ultrasound, is it? Not audible sound.
No, just normal sound.
Yeah.
Yeah, just normal sound.
Right.
So I just found this talk, so I'm not sure is that kind of thing.
I'm sort of curious, but
Yeah.
I don't think so, because it sounds like a data transmission problem rather than something specifically about multimedia services.
Okay. Okay, but some probably is more correct, some
Yeah.
probably is not. Okay. Then what about the fast encoding algorithm for the IoT device?
Well, again, there's some reason why it has to be particularly fast because IoT, then yes, put it in. But
It's based on that coding, but they're using different algorithm or different method.
right,
to
but
do it.
I just like to, I mean, I'm happy for it to be included if it's
Okay.
there, but I'd just like to understand what it is about the IoT that makes you particularly need to encode
Need to
fast,
this.
rather
Yeah,
than just generally wanting to encode fast.
yeah, because they are IoT device, so most of the time there we are talking to our real life.
Right, so
Real time thing.
Yeah.
Like if I will capture the image,
Yep.
if we can do a fast encoding, so we can send quickly,
Yeah.
so people can
So
see.
you reduce the delay.
Yeah, because of delay thing.
No,
Yeah.
that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not,
So
Am I-
I'm not sure my idea is correct or.
I think your idea is good, but I'm just a little bit worried that you're asking kind of yes/no questions to me. Is this in? Is this
Oh,
out? Without me getting across the big picture. And the big picture is what we want in this report. I think is why, examples of where multimedia processing changes as a result of being part of the IoT. And that's so. I understand the argument about why it should be low energy coding, and I understand the argument why, in some IoT applications it's a real time process, so you want high speed.
And because also some, I give you an example of the fast coding can be some sensor, they can detect the light or the temperature or something. If we can do the faster coding or something like that.
Yeah.
If the temperature change, then it's not going to be different later. So if we can do just an example,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
kind of thing. So
So
is that
that makes sense to me.
okay? So I'm on the right track.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Okay. No, that's
I doing some research. I know this is very difficult talk for this one, but I still want to go for it.
yeah, good. Good on you. Yeah, okay. No, it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
All right. See you.
So in my project, if I go to explain why we need this kind of the technology for the IoT,
Yeah. Yeah.
is that good for you to?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And also something about what the technology is and some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
how the technology gonna the multimedia technology gonna improve the IoT system?
Yeah.
Is that kind
Yeah,
of
that's a good summary. Yeah.
yeah, okay. I got a image like we already got like 3D, 4D cinema, right? In the so we can have a look and we maybe got different temperature. But for IoT things, it's good. Like for example, if we got a different sensor from around the world, like we're in the cinema. Okay, they say I want to go to Africa.
Oh, okay.
Go to Florida. Okay, so all the sensors can send in the data like what temperature and what brightness.
right, yeah.
Or like, this is my image. So so this kind of is multimedia, right? So
absolutely.
what color
Yeah.
should be in Africa? So I would see what animal in there.
Yeah.
So everything can be displayed
Yeah,
and
yeah.
all the stuff coming out.
Another interesting development recently is the arbitrary point of view. So you see images from whatever angle you like.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've seen that with sports programs lately, where they